Chapter 5 of Living Time by Maurice Nicoll. The Life in Living Time. With the addition of the fourth dimension, the great time world emerges, living where we thought it dead and gone. Our lives are extended through a minute portion of it. In this world in time, nothing can perish. Passing time makes things seem to perish, to pass away. We think of the world as a ball in space. We imagine, if we believe that the world was created, that it was made as a round mass. When we read that the ages were created, we do not grasp what is meant. Creation in time was meant. Imagine a day already created. Try to imagine a week as created and fashioned from beginning to end. The natural mind cannot do it. It can form no image of an already created day. Still less can it do so of an already created age. It is necessary to get rid of the sense of passing time and think of time itself. If we do this, then the expression from the Apocalypse of Peter, "Nothing perishes before God," becomes partly understandable. For everything stands in its place in time, and though today replaces yesterday, yesterday is always today for itself. Our passage through the dimension of time gives us the experience of succession. More than this, it gives us the impression of annihilation. We believe the past is annihilated. We believe yesterday cannot be anywhere. Where could there be room for it? How could there be room for yesterday today? I think it scarcely possible to describe how deeply our experience of passing time affects thought and feeling. It would be foolish to attempt to do so because we are psychologically built round the natural belief in passing time. It might be better to say annihilating time. So we seem to live the most fragile of existences in an ever-dying, sad environment, and our life seems only what we have at this moment or hope to get tomorrow. We have no other conception of the life. It seems to be nothing but the body at this instance, the scene before us. Yet the effects of the past on the present have been studied in the light of the unconscious persistence of early impressions, and the possibility of the effect of the future on the present has been inferred mathematically, taking the world as four-dimensional, for example by the Austrian mathematician H. Werle, who concludes that the future may overlap the past, so that in principle, quote, "It is possible to experience events now that would in part be an effect of my future resolves and actions," end quote, from space, time and matter. The interconnection of the world as a whole in higher dimensions suggests such a possibility. Higher space signifies possibilities, connections, interrelations undreamt of in the narrower space and time familiar to us. The definition of God as beginning and end has introduced us to this view, and we can recall here the definition in the New Testament which connects the idea of God with all possibilities. With God all things are possible. In both of these definitions I believe the idea of higher space appears, that is, of another connection of all things. Since the life is extended in time itself, the effect of the present upon the past is also to be considered as a possibility. The effects of what we do now, from this standpoint, are to be thought of as spreading in two definitely existing directions, not apprehended by our sensuous contact with the world. We call these directions past and future. From this point of view, our past life, our present life, and our future life are always in functional relationship. There are three elements or three influences at work. The past is no dead thing, nor the future a blank. The consequences of acts lying ahead of us and the consequences of acts lying in the past mingle with the consequences of acts lying in the present, and the determining point is now. Only, as we shall see, we do not know or possess this now, i.e., we have no determining point. It is certainly strange to think that the past may be changing through the action of the present and the future, but such thoughts belong only to the four-dimensional conception of man, through which all the life is made alive. Man is a living world line. let us conceive mankind as a network of these living lines in higher space. Let us suppose that the senses cut through all these lines at a point called present, showing us a cross-section, that is, a picture of three-dimensional bodies, a mass of perceptible people, in one moment of passing time called present. These living lines in four-dimensional space are then to be thought of as living organisms of which every part influences every other part. This four-dimensional organism is not the perceptible body, but the invisible body containing the visible body. By sense we are only related to the visible body itself, that is, as given perceptibly through sight and touch and hearing. Viewed thus, the life, rightly conceived, is not merely a local phenomenon in passing time, confined to the point we call the present, and isolated in the visible three-dimensional world. As direct experience it is so, but it is more. It is more because we are not regarding three-dimensional space as the sole container of things. It is the sole container so far as empirical experience, that is, the experience of our senses, reveals the world to us. We are trying to force our thoughts beyond the limits of sense, beyond that aspect of the total world rendered by sense, towards the realm of idea. We actually find such an exercise recommended in a passage from the ancient Hermetic literature, which belongs to the earliest centuries of our era. To reach another state, another level of understanding, we are told to expand ourselves to the magnitude of all existence. Only in this way, the writer says, can the life become permanently unified, changed into eternal substance. What is the magnitude of all existence? The sense of existence throughout all one's time is meant. The sense of this living organism in higher space which contains the little living organism of the temporal body. Quote, "Think that you are not yet begotten. Think that you are in the womb, that you are young, that you are old, that you are dead, that you are in the world beyond the grave. Grasp all that in your thought at once, all times and places." End quote, from the Hermetica. The perception of this idea, that the life is extended in time, is a step towards the unification of life, because all the life, strange and incredible, appears. The writer adds that only in this way can we begin to apprehend God, whereas if we shut the soul up in the bodily senses, i.e. think sensually, we can have no conception of God. Is not the idea of God here definitely connected with dimensions beyond those perceptible to sense, and so with higher reality in ourselves? Now if we're to grasp that we live at all points of our life, no longer can the distinction between yesterday, today and tomorrow be made, but something must yield in us before we cease to make this distinction. We come here against some very strong point of denial. From one side, this denial originates from our belief in the evidence of things seen, from our materialism. To perceive inwardly that the life lies in higher space, as a living process vowed from sense, means that we must be prepared to seize hold upon an idea, and this idea opens the life out, admits the life, draws the life together, causes the entire sense of the life to change. The illusion of passing time begins to be broken through. The relative nothingness that we give to yesterday and tomorrow begins to disappear. Speaking from another angle, Eckhart says that if we hold fast to the distinction between today and tomorrow and yesterday, we hold fast to nothingness. End quote. In higher space there is no time as we understand it, nothing of our past, present or future, nothing of our yesterday, today and tomorrow. With the sense of time itself, with the sense of the magnitude of all existence, would we not cease counting time as we do, cease making the particular distinction that we make between yesterday, today and tomorrow? For we make barriers between them and think of escaping into tomorrow, but it is really all the same, one today, the life itself. But we cut the life down to a little point which determines our will and woe. Tomorrow is still one's life, All the life makes a today, and we cannot escape from our life. All my life is. Of all my life, I must say, is. Let the reader note the feelings that begin to arise with this summoning up of the life apart from this present moment of existence, and the distinction between yesterday and tomorrow. In contrast to these feelings is our present moment psychology, which is governed by self-love and the belief in passing time. I am relating these two factors from the standpoint that the structure of our natural psychology is interlocked, one factor depending upon another factor. Any alteration in this structure, any change in the quality of consciousness, depends partly upon a change in the time factor. A change in the time factor will mean change in other directions as well. The Hermetic exercise is obviously designed to change the present momented psychology through a change in the time factor and a consequent expansion of consciousness throughout all the life. It hints that self-development is partly development into time, so we can understand that our apparent relationship to time gives us a wrong feeling of self. Self-love is a wrong feeling of self, and to begin to alter it, the living life must first be felt. This definite psychological effect of adding a dimension to the sense of oneself cannot be set aside. I say merely that the self-love is connected with our ordinary sense of time, and the Hermetic exercise is designed to give us a sense of living time. But the self-love requires a sharper environment and a more constant pressure for its transformation than our own thoughts. It particularly concentrates itself in the sense of present momented existence and the visible life of appearances, and in the related feelings of I. We see merely bodies existing in the present moment. We connect with these bodies the customary feeling of I. As such, we respond to moment and event having little or no background. The Hermetic exercise is to produce background through making the invisible side of things real. It is only through our conceptions of the invisible that we can change our present momented psychology. As it is, everything that happens to us at the moment influences us, and to every alteration in our present momented psychology we give the feeling of I. So we have a momentary psychology, against which the Hermetic exercise is surely directed. I maintain that this momentary psychology, into which the self-love enters so powerfully, rests partly, if not fundamentally, on the distinction between was, is, and will be, that is, on the belief in passing time which makes only the instant seem to be the site of the life. The result is a point of reaction that is overstressed and shifting, and one that gives no starting point for unity or integration, one in fact that could not possibly do so. It has been repeatedly taught in the past that man is in division, in a state of inner confusion. He is not one, but many. True philosophy has been defined as that which knows how to join him together, i.e., the integration of man was held to be possible. Integration means the binding together of parts into a whole, and so to become whole or complete. It means to become unified, to become one, and for this unification ideas that are foreign to our disintegrated psychology are necessary. Let us turn to some descriptions of man's multiple nature, bearing in mind that we make the greatest mistake if we suppose that we possess any oneness or unity naturally. Our ordinary state has been described by Synesius, 4th century, in these words: Man is not a simple object, nor is he cast in one pattern, but God has made to dwell in the constitution of a single creature a host of forces mingled together and with full-toned voices. We are, I think, a monstrous animal, more extraordinary than the Hydra, and still more many-headed. For not with the same part of our nature, of course, do we think and desire or feel pain and suffer anger, nor is our fear from the same source as our pleasure. Again, you will observe how there is a male element in these organs and a female, and that there is courage and also cowardice. There are, in sooth, all kinds of opposites within us, and a certain medial force of nature runs through which we call mind. Augustine Fitzgerald on Synthesis on Kingship, Volume 1, The Essays and Hymns of Synthesis of Cyrene. This multiple nature of man is described thus by Plutarch. Each one of us is made up of 10,000 different and successive states, a scrap heap of units, a mob of individuals. End quote. See Concerning the E at Delphi, in A.O. Pricard's Selected Essays of Plutarch. Having no unity, Plutarch remarks that we never really are, nor can we feel now. Quote, now is squeezed into the future or into the past, as though we should try to see a point which of necessity passes away to right or left. End quote. It is well described in a recent article, quote, a person is an assembly. This assembly consists of many dramatis personae who have come from different directions, animated by different inclinations and tending to different ends. Sometimes one of them gets up, gives a discourse or accomplishes an act, then reseats himself and remains silent, motionless, while another in his turn speaks and acts. At other times several of these personages get up together, support each other in their discourses and combine activities. But often too, those who get up are not in agreement one with the other. They dispute fiercely, quarrel, and anathematize each other. Occasionally, the assembly grows very tumultuous. All the members rise together and fight frenziedly. That is a person, and such is each one of us. End quote. Since we are an assembly, inner development and the reaching of unity cannot be taken separately. The one necessarily implies the other. Quote, unless he attains inner unity, man can have no I, can have no will. The concept of will in relation to a man who has not attained inner unity is entirely artificial. The whole of life is composed of small things which we continually obey and serve. Our eye continually changes as in a kaleidoscope. Every external event which strikes us, every sudden aroused emotion, becomes caliph for an hour, begins to build and govern, and is in its turn as unexpectedly deposed and replaced by something else. And the inner consciousness, without attempting to disperse the illusory designs created by the shaking of the kaleidoscope, and without understanding that in reality the power that decides and acts is not itself, endorses everything and says about these moments of life in which different external forces are at work, this is I, this is I. End quote, from Ouspensky, A New Model of the Universe. There have been many systems of thought, religious and otherwise, with corresponding methods, whose object was exactly to bring about unity of being. The systems differ, but the object is the same. All these systems are means to an end, not ends in themselves. They belong to different periods and different conditions of culture. To compare them with one another in order to prove by their discrepancies that they cannot have any truth is beside the point. In all these systems there is always much that is very difficult to understand, much that the natural mind cannot understand. This is necessarily so, for a system that does not stand beyond the natural reason, that is based on the sensory world, cannot open levels of reality beyond that one on which we ordinarily dwell. A scientific religion, based on the logic of natural science and our known reality, is a contradiction in terms, for if we take religion as meaning binding together again, it means that its true significance, long ago lost sight of, is the attainment of unity, and unity connotes higher reality. The usual state of man is put in a somewhat different way in the following passage from the Hermetic literature. The real is that which consists of itself alone, and continues to be such as it is in itself. But man is composed of many different things, and does not continue to be such as he is in himself, but shifts and changes from one form to another. Oftentimes men fail to recognize their children after a short interval, and children their parents. When a thing so changes that it is not known, how can it be real? Is it not an illusion inasmuch as its changes manifest themselves in varying appearances? You must understand that whatever is, and that alone, is real. But man is not a thing that ever is, and therefore man is not real, but is only an appearance. We ought to call man appearances. We ought to call a child the appearance of a child, a youth the appearance of a youth, an adult the appearance of an adult man, etc. And that is from Hermetica, Volume 1. We believe that there is something more, but what more is there in a practical sense? If we are capable of honesty with ourselves, we are very little more than creatures of the moment, but we think we are not. We imagine that we are merely resting, merely abiding our time. We believe that what is I in us never changes, and that we could always be different if we wished. And just as we imagine that we act consciously and could behave differently if we wished, so we believe that we have one I, a unity, a permanent reality, that precedes over all that we do. If we read that we are an assembly, or a monstrous animal more extraordinary than the Hydra, and still more many-headed, we do not really believe it. To know that this is so is to begin to have a knowledge that does not belong to the natural sense-governed mind. Even to begin to know this is already to begin to have a changed feeling of oneself, a moment of arrest in the current of our illusions, a doubt, who am I? It is in this direction that the possibilities of changing lie. Ouspensky emphasizes this psychological principle, for behind all becoming lies that which we cannot reach, cannot concentrate upon, just because we cannot turn the feeling of I towards it, but are dragged back into the I of the moment, into the stream of passing time. It was mentioned previously that sometimes we feel the unreality of all that we do, or see, or say, or think, and then it is really the illusory feeling of I deserts us. But since any other feeling of I is strange, we only feel fear, as if we were being dissolved away. We begin to move, say something, clear our throats in order to get back to the familiar feeling of oneself. So we can understand how distasteful at first we find ideas that threaten to dissolve this reality. Indeed, all the natural mind fights against them. Yet if we desire change, it is necessary to escape from the power of these eyes of the passing moment that mutually exclude one another and act as a transient caliph. There must be another stimulus. All that belongs to passing time will not help, but an idea about time can help. An idea about a thing puts us into a definite position in regard to it. It is in this that the power of an idea first lies. If we could feel the idea of time itself, of all our life lying in time, the momentary eye of passing time would not have the same hold over us. The idea gives us a certain power, even a certain freedom. This is where its value lies. Instead of saying, "This is I," we should begin to realize, "This is not I." What reason had the Hermetic writer to tell us to expand ourselves to the magnitude of all existence? This power of vast combination was recommended as an exercise that leads towards the transmutation of a man into eternal substance. When Eckhart tells us to escape from time, is he not saying the same thing? But no natural ideas formed from what we actually see will help us to do this. Our senses imprison us in the present moment and make passing time. The visible world, the senses, the eye of the moment, all these unite to produce one effect, a pinpoint of reality that we take as all. We are told to expand this pinpoint into the magnitude of all existence. By being all, the man himself is none of them. To know and to recognize all that is in one's life, to begin to know and remember all sides of oneself, to feel all the life, that is to begin to change and cease to be always only one of these little eyes of the moment. And if we think of eternal as meaning wholeness or unity, then we can understand that as long as we are only these little eyes, and as long as our consciousness enters entirely into them, there can be no possibility of any real being, no wholeness. So against becoming and changing in passing time, we must first put the idea of the life extended in time. This is the first idea that challenges our present momented psychology. We have already noticed the connection between this idea and the unification of the life. The unification of the life depends on another understanding of time. Put in another way, our ordinary feeling of I does not enable us to reach unity. But we have already connected a different understanding of time with a different level of consciousness. Unification of the life, the attainment of a new level of consciousness, a different understanding of time, and a new feeling of I are thus all related. We shall see later that they are all included in the ancient idea of eternal life. What am I? I am my life. All my life is my time. The present moment of my life is in the allness of my life, a point in the magnitude of my existence. And this allness is my only time. Life in itself is time for man. For man there is and cannot be any other time outside the time of his life. Man is his life. His life is his time. And that is life for him. There is no tomorrow for a man beyond the time of his life. Quote, man dies because his time ends. There can be no tomorrow after death, but only one's life. End quote, from Ouspensky, A New Model of the Universe. Remember that the life itself is indestructible. Passing time brings us to the end of the life beyond which there is nothing for us. It is an end just as in the world of three-dimensional objects the end of a table is its termination in known space. There is no table beyond. The hand passing over the table no longer touches it, so that for the hand the table ceases to exist, but not for the eye. In the same way the life seems to be destroyed, to end. It does end. But four-dimensionally it is still there and is indestructible, just as the world is indestructible. People imagine the world might be destroyed by the release of atomic forces. That is impossible. It may come to an end in passing time, but that only means that its time length, or life, does not extend beyond that point. The real destruction of the world will be its destruction in higher dimensions from beginning to end, at all points of its time length, and the force necessary for such destruction is not found in physical energies. No explosion or electronic bombardment could effect this. Its life could not be destroyed any more than a man's life in time can be destroyed by shooting him now. We cannot shoot into time, no bullet can shoot the life, and no act of self-destruction can destroy the life. No one can change himself beyond his life, hereafter, beyond his time, but only within his life. His attainment of unity is something that must belong to his life, this life that is himself. And if we can equate unity and eternal life, it is something that cannot lie in some tomorrow or hereafter beyond a man's life. Its possibilities belong to us now, to something that we have to do now. It is this life that must be worked upon, be made more real, by separating the false, by insight. Now the idea of unity is not to be taken negatively, although it is often connected with the process of getting free from certain things in oneself. It is also anciently as often connected with the idea of growth, through which the different sides of man are brought into balance. Plato describes this harmony in terms of justice, i.e. a just balance, and adjusting. In the New Testament the same word is rendered righteous. Plato says, but in reality justice was such as we were describing, being concerned not with the outer man, but the inward, which is the true concernment of man. For the just man does not permit the several elements to interfere with one another, or any of them to do the work of others. He sets in order his own inner life, and his own master and his own law, and at peace with himself, and when he has bound together the three principles within him, which may be compared to the higher, lower, and middle notes of the scale, and the intervening intervals, when he has bound them together, and he is no longer many, but has become one entirely temperate and perfectly adjusted nature, then he proceeds to act, if he has to act, whether in a matter of property or the treatment of the body, or in some affairs of politics or private business, always thinking and calling that which preserves and co-operates with the harmonious condition, just and good action, and the knowledge that proceeds over it, wisdom, and that which at any time impars this condition, he will call unjust action, and the opinion which proceeds over its ignorance. End quote from the Republic 4, page 443. A real change in the internal state is meant, not an external modification of conduct to be seen of men. All we do now can be made of infinitely more consequence through additional interpretation. If rightly understood, the extension of the life in higher dimensions, with all the new thoughts and feelings that it can arouse, of its truth is perceived, can make us think far more distinctly about our present situation, and in a way that makes everything and person more real. For we can then understand that it is about our lives that we have to think, about all that enters and lies in our lives, about which we are always trying to think, but wrongly owing to the illusion of passing time, and the sense of the life being only in the present. Let us approach some illustrations of experiencing of the life extended in time that have been put on record. They are not remarkable at first sight, partly because inner experiences cannot be easily described. Yet if we really begin to think about their meaning, they are remarkable. They serve to show that all the life can be undoubtedly felt. It is quite wrong, and far too easy, to think of them merely as curious, abnormal, or pathological. While the unification of the life as one whole, or the sense of the external existence of I, is not illustrated by them, the experience of the living existence of all the length, all the time of the life is shown. In an essay on time and space, Taylor Lewis says that we have all heard of well-attested cases in which the entire past, even to its most minute events, have flashed upon the soul in the dying moments or during some brief period of imminent danger. Quote, arousing the spirit to a pre-natural energy, if there be truth in such experiences, then no former exercise or motion of the soul is ever lost. End quote. He points out that since such experiences undoubtedly happen, it means that all the moments of our lives can be regarded as present. Quote, they belong to us still just as much as our present thought or our present sensation, and at some period may start up again, causing us actually to realize that conception of Boethius, which now appears only as a scholastic subtlety, a whole life ever in one, carrying with it a consciousness of its whole abiding presence in every moment of its existence. End quote. Taylor Lewis, article on time and space. But I do not think that the feeling of the life as one integrated whole could ever be connected with an experience of the extension of all the life in time, because it would necessarily be of a different order, a summing up of parts. The life is certainly experienced under special conditions as stretched out in consciousness throughout its entire length. All the incidents can be re-experienced, relived in an actual sense, difficult to describe but not merely as memory. But the feeling of the unity of the life, gathered into one simultaneous whole, cannot be the same thing. For the experience of oneness, which is associated with the feeling of eternity, is not merely an expansion of consciousness through the time dimension of the life, in which the reality of all the life is unquestionably felt, but another kind of consciousness, similar rather to that described by Tennyson. It is possible to understand that whatever is experienced in separate parts in succession may be summed up at another level of reality into a whole or simultaneous form. The experience of this whole and simultaneous form will not be commensurable with the running experience of separate parts. If our consciousness expands along time, we will see and know our life in some sort of series, as we knew it, but not as gathered together into a new synthesis. Our ordinary memory makes us think that the past has no living existence. It is memory. But in the following experiences, there is no way of understanding them save by admitting that the past has a reality that we do not suspect, some substantial living existence. The past is lived, entered, not exactly again, for it is always there. Something transcending memory is experienced. All is, nothing is lost. What was long ago forgotten appears. The childhood is, and all the faces that belong to it. The early books are, the fragments of poetry, the stories, the early scenes, the houses, gardens, the days themselves. In one example it is said, this and most of the following examples will be found in Forbes Winlow's Obscure Diseases of the Mind, 1860. The scenes of his early life were in their minutest particulars revived. He was taken to the cottage in which he was born, interchanged tokens of affection with his parents, gumboled once more with the companions of his childhood on the village green. Quote, he renewed acquaintance with the friends of his school days, the remembrances of faces known when a child was restored. Every trifling and minute circumstance connected with his past life was presented to him. End quote. All this happened in the few moments during the struggle with death from asphyxiation. Now the language of memory is used in such descriptions, but they are not cases of memory as we know it. It is not recollection, remembrance, or reminiscence. It is actually being present in the past. It is the experience of the presence of the past. We have no language for this. Another example, quote, under the pressure of great feeling, the soul lives with a rapidity and intensity which disturb all its usual relation to time. It once happened to me to assist at the recovery of a man who nearly forfeited his life while bathing. He had sunk the last time, and there was difficulty in getting him to land, and still greater difficulty in restoring him. He said the time had seemed to him of very great duration. He had lost the standard of the work of time. He had lived his whole past over again. He had not epitomized it. He had repeated it, as it seemed to him, in detail and with the greatest deliberation. He had great difficulty in understanding that he had only been in the water a few minutes. During these intenser moments of existence, the life of the soul has no sort of relation to what we call time. End quote. Certainly not to what we call time, but to time itself. We cannot call this memory, nor can we understand it unless we think of ourselves as at least four-dimensional beings. Memory epitomizes. It makes a summary or abstract of the past, and shows it as the past always, as something that was. In the above case, the life is restored as present. All ordinary relationship to time was obliterated. All present moment is psychology. His soul, no longer conscious as at that moment of world time in which the visible, three-dimensional outer scene appears to the senses, ceased to share with others the common point of material existence, called by us the present. Where did it go? What direction did it find in which to travel? It did not pass into non-entity, nothingness, nor into some tomorrow or hereafter. It passed into the dimension of its own life, which the man only knew until then as intermittent, past-coloured memory. It passed into the life itself, into the man's time, not forward into time beyond. One writer says, quote, the hints of Scripture point to memory as the chief energy of the soul under the new conditions of its existence, that is, at death. The words of Abraham to the rich man in Hades were, Son, remember. He was to survey the whole extent of that life in which he had received his good things and had cared for little or nothing else. And these words at least fall in with some of the known facts of consciousness in this life. To many, it is said, notably to those who have been in the peril of sudden death by drowning, and have, as it were, tasted its experiences, there comes, as in a moment of time, the unrolling of the scroll of their whole past lives. Their memory acts with a new intensity and with an almost inconceivable rapidity. It becomes, To borrow a phrase from the dream of Geronosius, the standard of its own chronology. Even under the conditions of a calmer death, we note something of the same kind. The mind goes back to the remote past of its life, and the scenes of childhood and the old familiar faces come back with a long-vanished distinctness. It is almost inconceivable that such a retrospect should not affect the soul in which there is a capacity for growth." End quote. From E. H. Plumtree, The Spirits in Prison, 1885. Certainly such memory could not but change our lives, but it is not memory, it is higher space apprehended. If such consciousness of the life entered into every moment of our existence, nothing could remain the same, and this is precisely the exercise the Hermetic writer advises. It is just because we do not have this kind of memory, just because our memory is very limited and largely invented, that we again and again act in the same way and are again and again in those recurring momentary eyes of which Ouspensky speaks. The power of life is so strong, the hypnotism of the present moment so intense, the outer scene pouring in upon us through the senses so vivid that we cannot remember. And which of us ever thinks that he is not merely this visible body in the present moment of time, but something else in higher dimensions? I once asked Dr. Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, toward the end of his life the question, "What is a man?" He answered without hesitation, "A series of states of consciousness." The word series introduces the element of time, the relation of which to states of consciousness is empirical and not essential. Broadly speaking, certain states of consciousness associated directly or indirectly with matter occur in sequence in everyday human experience, but the same states may occur simultaneously under exceptional circumstances. It is well known that in the sudden presence of imminent and apparently certain death, the accumulated states of consciousness of a lifetime sometimes revive simultaneously in a single flash. The events of the whole past are seen down to the most minute and remote details, like a landscape under a flash of lightning. Dr. Holmes himself had had this experience on one occasion, just before losing consciousness altogether while drowning, and the memory of the occurrence persisted after resuscitation. And that was a quote from William Sturgis Bigelow, Buddhism and Immortality, 1908. Another example, quote, "From the moment that all exertion had ceased, a calm feeling of the most perfect tranquillity superseded the previous tumultuous sensations. Though the senses were deadened, not so the mind. Its activity seemed to be invigorated in a ratio which defied description, for thought arose after thought with a rapidity of succession that is not only indescribable, but probably inconceivable by anyone who has not been in a similar situation. The event which had just occurred, falling into the sea, the effect it would have on a most affectionate father, and 1,000 other circumstances, minutely associated with home, were the first series of reflections that occurred. Then they took a wider range, our last cruise, a former voyage, my school, and even all my boyish pursuits and adventures. Thus, travelling backwards, every past incident of my life seemed to glance across my recollection in retrograde succession, not, however, in mere outline, but the picture filled up with every minute and collateral feature. In short, the whole period of my existence seemed to be placed before me in a kind of panoramic review. Indeed, many trifling events, which had long been forgotten, then crowded into my imagination, and with the character of recent familiarity. The length of time that was occupied by this deluge of ideas, or rather the shortness of time into which they were condensed, I cannot now state with precision, yet certainly 2 minutes could not have elapsed from the moment of suffocation to that of my being hauled up." End quote. In connection with this restoration of the past, the power of smell to revive former scenes must not be forgotten. Quote, "For odours have an extraordinary and inexplicable power of spontaneously and suddenly presenting a forgotten scene to the mind, and with such nearness to reality that we are translated bodily, being caught up by the spirit, as it were, like St. Philip, to be placed once more in the midst of the old past life, where we live the moment over again with the full chord of its emotions vibrating in ourselves and startling our consciences. There are, it is true, certain sounds which wield the same miraculous power over our being, but I do not think they operate in this way so frequently as do smells." End quote. D. Mackenzie, Aromatics. Baudelaire, in one of his poems, referred to the grain of incense which restores the past. The use of incense may have been originally connected with this power of odours to bring the living past into consciousness. We know that all living tissue is constantly undergoing changes. There is a continual assimilation and elimination, a constant interchange between cell, blood and lymph. The material substance of the brain cells is always being built up anew by this interchange. Let us face the question, do we really imagine that the past is coiled up in the matter of these three-dimensional brain cells that are undergoing such constant changes? The trouble is that we never face such questions. We do not want to face them. Even if we were satisfied that the ordinary memory could be explained solely on a physiological basis, how could we understand the restoration of the entire life as shown in the above examples? The psyche must be more dimensioned than the physiological brain. The brain can be regarded as reflecting at any one moment a small part of the psyche, and if the brain is injured, the reflection will necessarily be distorted. But we cannot limit the psyche to three-dimensional space. The psychic life is in higher space, and its point of communication with the visible world at a given moment is through the brain. We cannot explain the psychic life of man merely by the study of the three-dimensional brain. Thought is not in apprehended space. We cannot explain the restoration of the past in terms of the brain alone. This inner memory in which there is such wealth of detail must have another explanation. A division of memory into two kinds has been described by Swedenborg. He divides memory into exterior and interior. The former he connects with what he calls the outer man, the latter with inner man. Nothing, he says, perishes, though things are obliterated to the exterior memory. Such is the interior memory that the very least details of what a man has thought, said, or done from earliest infancy to old age are inscribed upon it. All his aims, which were in obscurity for him, and all that he has thought, said, or done through them, are in that book which is his interior memory." End quote. He observes that the book of life, mentioned in the scriptures, which is opened at death, is just this interior memory. If we connect this interior memory with the extension of our lives in higher dimensions, we can understand that the book of life is the book of the life. It is the life itself, lying in time itself as a long-living organism, inserted at one point of itself through brain and body into the present moment of passing time. Ecclesiastes speaks of man at his death going to his long home. Because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Chapter 12, verse 5. Taylor Lewis says that the Hebrew Beth Olam might be translated as house of the life. It certainly does not mean the grave. The body goes to the grave. The man enters his life, this long organism, his long home, his indestructible time. As I said, every part of this long organism must act and react on every other part, because beginning and end are coexistent. Whatever we do now must affect what we call past and future. We cannot understand how the past can be altered unless we comprehend our existences through the power of this idea about time itself.